now, the Office of the Ombud for Financial Service Providers has warned of a growing number of funeral parlours and other providers of funeral policies who operate outside the law. They're not being regulated in terms of the Financial Advisory and Intermediary Services Act of 37, that's of 2002. Now, let's get more on this story, and we are joined by the manager, the Team Resolution Manager Office of the Ombud, and Marc Alves is the person to talk to there. Marc, good morning to you, and thank you very much for your time. When you say the funeral providers are working outside of the law, what does that mean in practice?
All right. Morning, Claudia. Thank you for having me. Look, there's two factors here when it comes to funeral parlours or funeral providers acting outside of the law. The first is that they're more often than not, and what we find in our complaints is they're not registered with the Financial Services Conduct Authority, FSCA for short. So if you don't have a license with the FSCA, you're not deemed to be fit and proper. All right. The FSCA provides you a license, which then obviously confirms that you're fit and proper to do the job, but also that you demonstrate the necessary competency to do that. So again, we would encourage individuals or the man in the street out there, when they're dealing with such providers, to request whether or not they are licensed, and then to get to be given that license number, and that license number can be checked on the website at the FSCA, www.fsca.co.za. The other aspect, okay, is that even though some of these funeral providers are indeed registered with the FSCA, they're not underwritten by an insurer. Okay, that's contrary to the Insurance Act. The Insurance Act provides that whatever business, whatever funeral products that you provide are underwritten by a registered insurer, and that means that you have peace of mind. Okay, if you're a consumer of that product, that there is somebody standing behind that funeral provider that will pay out those claims when indeed you need to claim, and you have, an instance to do so. So when we're talking about acting outside of the law, number one, not being registered with the FSCA as required by the law, and second of all, even if you are registered, not having an underwriter for your product and a regulated insurer to underwrite that product. And that's what we mean by acting outside of the law.
Yeah. There's also the concern that these funeral parlours that are acting outside of the law, they are also working or relying on some financial services providers on the question of risk profiling questionnaires to the detriment of the client. Are you able to fill us in there exactly what it is you're talking about? Because I think you're pointing to some kind of collusion.
When it comes to risk profiling questionnaires are not normally done for your funeral parlours, your funeral assistance type of business. When we talk about the risk profiling questionnaires, that's more for all other types of financial services that are rendered to a client. And that is in terms of Section 8(1)(c) of the General Code, which requires that any recommendation you make to a client must satisfy that person's risk profile as well as their circumstances. So what we're finding is that when risk profiles are done, okay, and we use the term, it's important. I think words are important because we talk about a risk profile, but more often than not, the risk profile is just simply a risk questionnaire, or what they call a risk profiling questionnaire. And that risk profiling questionnaire is simply to determine the person's risk tolerance, so whether or not you have a tolerance for risk. A risk profile is a lot more than that. It's not more than just a piece of paper that you complete a couple of questions, you get a particular score for the questions that you answer, and then according to that, they determine whether or not you're conservative, you're moderate, or you're aggressive. Okay, investor, and then they will invest or provide advice in regards to any investments you make based on that score that you get. Now, that is only one part of doing a risk profile. All right. A risk profile is so much more. It looks at maybe the risk that you can afford to take. Sometimes, depending on the product, it looks at the risk that you may have to take in terms of your particular situation. So these risk profiling questionnaires that are used are very limited, okay, in terms of what you're looking at the bigger picture for the client. But what we get when we're investigating complaints is that, for example, there's a common question that says, how long do you foresee yourself investing in a particular product? Or how long would you like to save your money? And they give you various bands, and one of those is, for example, I'd like to invest between 4 and 7 years. And you get a particular score for that, and then you carry on, and that determines your risk profile, okay, or your risk tolerance. Now, when you then get a complaint and you say, well, look, why did you recommend product X, which confine the client to a particular 5-year term, for example? Why was that appropriate to the client's needs and circumstances? They then go back to the risk profiling questionnaire and say, look, he completed this question which says 4 to 7 years. Therefore, it's clear that he wanted a term of at least 5 years. So that's why we gave him this product, which then, kind of like confines him or gets him stuck in a 5-year term.
Yeah.
And that's obviously disingenuous, because the client was asking a simple question or answering a particular question of how long he would like or foresee himself investing in a particular product or in his funds, okay? But he wasn't actually saying to you, listen, I actually want to be confined to a 5-year period, okay? So that's why we say that these risk profiling questionnaires that are used primarily to determine someone's risk tolerance are then used when we investigate complaints to say it was appropriate to put this client in a 5-year termed investment because he wanted to invest for that particular period.
Yeah.
All right. And again, unless the client knows exactly the consequences of how they're answering those questions, and that information is going to be used to justify why you locked them into a particular product, then that is obviously a concern for this office.
Let's then talk about the impact of this practice, Mark, if it is allowed to continue. What are the risks involved?
We're talking about the risk profiling.
Indeed. Yes, indeed.
Sorry?
I am. Yes, I am.
Okay. Look, the risk profiling, it's okay. The practice is not a bad practice. Okay. What we're saying though is it should only, you're doing a risk profiling questionnaire, for example, should not be your sole manner in which you determine a client's risk profile. Because, again, we're talking about a risk profile, okay? And a person's risk tolerance is but one part of that risk profile, okay? So you determine the risk profile. We're looking at advisors or financial service providers to then say, okay, we have your risk tolerance, but there's a certain risk that you need to take, for example, depending on your situation in life. And then there also be a certain risk that you can afford to take. So you may fill out this questionnaire and it says, I'm an aggressive investor. But when the FSP looks at you as a whole, all right, he then looks and says, well, yes, you may have a nice tolerance for risk, but based on your particular situation and the source of the funds, etc., this is maybe not something that you should consider. You may need to look at coming down a bit and becoming more conservative in your approach. And then on the other side of the coin, a person may say, listen, I'm a conservative investor, okay, on the risk profiling questionnaire that's answered, but yet where he is in his particular circumstances, he may need to take a little bit more risk to achieve what he needs to achieve. And that's the risk profiling questionnaire is not, for example, a bad thing, but it shouldn't be used in isolation, all right? The client, none of us live in a bubble, okay? We all must be looked at as a whole, and there's many factors to look at rather than do you like risk or do you not like risk, okay?
Right.
There's a lot of other factors to figure in. So again, from what our office is mainly concerned about is that when this information is then used to justify a particular product that is given, and that is where we have a concern, and that is what we're addressing when we investigate complaints.
Does your office intend involving law enforcement?
Well, I think no, that at the moment, no. We're hoping to change what do you call it? We were hoping to change behavior through our decisions that we make as an office. And we have had some kind of success in that regard. So we are, as we're working through complaints and as we issue more, again, a big part of that was the annual report that we issued. That is a big part of getting the message out there and informing both FSPs and clients, okay, of the stance that we're going to take. But in terms of involving law enforcement, it's not necessary at this stage.
Marc Alves, let's leave the conversation there. Thank you very much for your time. He is a team resolution manager in the Office of the Financial Service Providers.